I think I've got the best job today, I have to say, which is being able to pose questions and start the conversation with the panellists, all of whom have made fantastic presentations already this morning. Just want to preface that a little bit with a couple of thoughts on resilience. My role tends to be focused around the resilience of the cultural and creative sector, and probably more by necessity than design. That's tended particularly to focus on our funded organisations at Arts Council. And I think today is also about resilience, but broader than that. I think we're talking about the resilience of partnerships. I think we're talking about the resilience, particularly with the current government agenda, perhaps of our institutions and of our wider sector. So it's about the way that we live, the world we live in, and the way that we kind of help shape the communities that we want to live in, I think. And with that in mind, sort of what is resilience, I think, is always the question that comes up. I think there's a big difference between a successful organisation and a resilient organisation. And Kodak, BlackBerry, Woolworths come to mind as examples of organisations who have been very successful, but don't think we would describe them as very resilient. So in the very short space of time to talk about it, I think basically the key thing for me today about resilience is about it being forward-looking. So resilience is about the future. Success can be in the present, hopefully not in the past. But resilience is very much about thinking about what's to come. And I think in terms of what the important issues around resilience are, many of them have been touched on already in the presentations. Diversity is absolutely at the heart of that. I think unless we have great work, great partnerships, which reflect 21st century England, they're not going to engage communities. It's not going to be great work. We're going to be missing those voices. And I think the creative case, which Arts Council and the sector have together started to develop, and particularly in this context, the creative case North work, which is happening, which is very significant, and a lot of the cultural organisations here are involved in. I think that is a real opportunity for the partnerships in the room and the new ones to come to kind of really take a lead on putting diversity in a cultural context. Pat touched very much on digital. That's an area where the cultural sector is perhaps still learning. We can benefit hugely from the expertise, I think, of the BBC. We can use research to help improve our digital skills. And we can also think about how we then develop projects, how we co-create, how we co-commission, and how we engage audiences differently through partnerships working together. And I think the Yorkshire Dance, Leeds University, Breakfast Creative project is a really, really good example of how that can happen with the Respond platform. I think that's also an interesting example of some of the things that's distinctive about the North partnerships and the way that many of them, and particularly the very successful ones, have managed to move from project base and project funding into being the kind of wide-ranging strategic partnerships that Andrew mentioned in terms of Opera North and the university here. And I think that's one of the things that we're looking to develop more perhaps through the forum and through the networks here. And I suppose that also raises the question of impact, which again has been touched on in the presentations. I used to work in social investment, and every social investor and pretty much every social investee has their own way of measuring and talking about impact. And maybe that is the right way to go. Maybe there is no one-size-fits-all way of articulating the impact of some of the partnerships and some of the sectors that we have. But I think it'll remain a kind of challenge and something that we need to keep considering. And perhaps the biggest challenge, and the last one that I wanted to mention before the conversation starts, in terms of resilience, is the need to examine our organisations and our business models continually to make sure that they really are fit for purpose. I think within the cultural and creative sector, as we all know, there's a high percentage of self-employed people working in micro-businesses. And I think with some of our cultural institutions, they're probably ones which people who were around 50 years ago would still feel very familiar with. So I think in the context of today's discussion, one of the things that's interesting is where do we go now in terms of partnerships? And I was just speculating kind of in that half-asleep way on the morning train today, and thinking, well, what if Arts Council's 2022 portfolio was solely about creative hubs? What if everything we funded was a partnership between universities, creative industries, and cultural organisations? And how would that then embody the three things which are the priorities for the forum in terms of research, civic engagement, and cultural and creative career pathways? So that's one way that it might go in the future. Slightly surprised to see our chair nodding. I'll take that as a sign of approval.
I always nod at you. Always. Doesn't matter what you say, I always nod.
That's why he's the best chair you could possibly have. And so with that, I think definitely time to open the conversation. So we're very happy to take questions. There was one question that I wanted to ask just in the context of partnerships to kick things off and to give me a chance to sit down, which was to ask each of you what you think is the key thing in terms of partnerships. What's the one thing you would say makes a really successful, sustainable partnership?
Who's going first?
You are.
Oh, right. Well, I think I'm going to do what I normally do, is state the bleeding obvious, because it doesn't do any harm. A community of interest and the ability to speak the same language. I think the community of interest is perfectly obvious in the discussions we're having today, but I think the second bit, speaking the same language, is the difficulty. And so what we need to do, and I hope part of this happens today, is we need to better understand the pressures, the jargon, the terminology, and all those other things that you get from different sectors. And once you crack that code, then the community of interest, I agree with you, by the way, at the back, takes off like mad, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. Pat?
I think a respect for respective areas of expertise is really critical. And to kind of just lay that out at the very beginning. You know, I wouldn't dream of putting on a live event in a city and telling that city which roads to close. And equally, it's sometimes quite difficult when people that have never worked in filmmaking or radio production want to direct what it looks like. So I think that that kind of mutual respect of different areas of expertise and a very open dialogue and a very close working relationship is really, really key.
Well, if I think about a partnership that Leeds University had with Opera North while I was here, I would say time and tenacity and trust. It was the ability to stick with something and stick with it over a period of time. I'm looking at Richard here, but my feeling was that 3 or 4 years in, there were certain conversations that we just didn't need to have anymore because we trusted each other and we understood each other. And 3 or 4 years in, we could start to be more ambitious, to experiment, to take more risks, because there was a depth of relationship there. And I think that one of the problems that we face in, to use Alistair's phrase, these two worlds coming together, is to not have partnerships that have to be invested in project funding all the time. So, you've got a prospect, they might last for 1 year or 2 or 3 if you're lucky. If you can look out a decade and say, we're going to stick with each other over that decade, that transforms the relationship and what you can do with it. So I think one of the challenges we face is how we better mobilize the resource that we need in order to sustain relationships over that period. And that was, I think, the transformative thing for the Opera North Leeds University partnership, was to take it from a partnership with 2 of the university's faculties and to elevate it into a university-wide strategic partnership where you could have that length and depth of commitment.
Thank you. I'd now like to open it up to the floor. I think we've got a couple of roving mics which are going. So, a question here, and there's a roving mic on the balcony as well, so not that my eyesight's quite that good. And if you could just say who you are, please, before you ask your question.
Okay, hi, I'm Kwong Lee, Director of Castlefield Gallery in Manchester. It was really good to hear from the 3 different spheres, and as Alistair said, these 3 spheres really develop our citizenship, our participation. I want to just make a comment and then ask a question, if I may. The comment I want to make is that Peter mentioned that arts and culture are the incubation of creative industries. I want to add that small arts organizations are the R&D departments of the arts and culture in general. And speaking from a small arts organisation. I want to kind of ask the question about partnership and how do we avoid being risk averse? Because when public funding is squeezed and we know that we are competing with very worthy public funding benefits and other spheres like health and education, how do we make sure that we're not so risk averse that we only do the most popular things, the most things that are gratifying and entertaining, but not necessarily development? I think we all talk about talent development. So really in the spheres of, I see risk aversity may be a counterpoint to what we want to achieve in terms of talent development and diversity, achieving those two goals.
Pat, could we start with you and then?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's something that we think about a lot. And particularly when there's a lot less money sloshing around, frankly. And I've worked at the BBC my entire life, and one of the reasons that I've stayed there is because we can take risks. But you have to be really disciplined about it, I think. And I think with less money, you have to be even more focused on it. And I'm talking purely just on the perspective of the BBC. But it is critical, and in terms of how you do it, it's about saying it to your colleagues and your partners all the time, and just having that frame of reference. We've just commissioned a series which is getting very mixed reviews on train spotters. You can't get much more kind of risk averse than that in a way, and it might just go down really badly. But it's important to try things. Sometimes things take 11 years to get commissioned. In some of the projects that I've done, the commissioners were frankly terrified, particularly actually with the big first event we did here in Leeds. And it was full of risk, but really, really critical. And it's about having the conversation all the time and not forgetting it. I personally build that into objectives of people that I work with in terms of kind of appraisals and thinking about that. So it's not just a casual conversation, but it's a real thing. It's a real objective.
Thank you. And Peter, are we becoming more risk averse?
Well, I don't think we are. I'd be very interested to hear back from the questioner about whether you feel under pressure and you feel that you have been more risk averse than you ought to be. And I'd be interested to hear your personal perspective. Look, if you want to avoid being risk averse, what you have to do is to make sure you offend the Daily Mail at least once a week. I've always thought that's a touchstone in arts and culture. And actually, there's a serious point there, which is that I always like to say that the purpose of public money, and actually it doesn't matter whether it's Arts Council or an educational institution or the BBC, the purpose of public money is to take risks. Today's outrage is tomorrow's mainstream, and that is sort of true of arts and culture for hundreds of years. What is considered completely outrageous in one decade, within several decades, is regarded as entirely mainstream. And so it is important for arts and culture to constantly push and so on. But the relationship between an artist and the audience is a complex one, because an artist wants an audience. If an artist only sets out to piss off an audience, they don't have an audience, and that rather defeats the object of the exercise. And if you're curating or programming an arts institution, it means that you want an element of entertainment and crowd-pleasing stuff. You want to bring people in, and then you want to challenge them and surprise them and push them a bit. So it's a more complex thing than simply, just taking risks, isn't it? It has to be seen in the whole. But if I may, I'd really like to know whether you feel you're being risk-averse yourself. And the mic is coming from behind you, so there you are. Do you mind? I'm just intrigued to hear.
Thanks. I think I am. I think I come from a practice background. I run an arts organisation which has got 32 years history of artist development, and I find myself very, trying to straddle between caring about developing practice and his audiences. I mean, you make a really good point there. I'm not advocating for 1 minute that the arts and culture should be so risk-taking that it alienates people. That's not what I'm talking about. But I think the culture that I feel being an MPO, which is a great thing, obviously, you know, having that stability and local authority funding too. I feel that I can't really develop the artists and new art with the ordinances as much as I would like, because for example, financial risk, you know, the tick box of financial risk is such a big thing, because if I'm competing with a larger organization that's got a really settled structure and really kind of a track record of, you know, can't fail kind of thing, I'm at a disadvantage. That's how I feel. I think lots of small organizations feel the same way, that we can't take risk in a good way.
I think that's a conversation that is going to carry on over lunch.
No, it's good. Really interesting to hear.
Thank you. Any more questions for the panel? Andrew.
Hi, is that on? I'm Andrew Dixon. I'm the bid advisor for Leeds' bid for European Capital of Culture. I suppose what I've been involved in for 30 years is joining up cities, Newcastle, Gateshead, Hull and UK City of Culture bid. What I'm interested in is the sort of partners who aren't here today, and what you think we can do to incentivise business to get involved in culture in a more dynamic way. We've had things like arts and business in the past that have been on the edges of engaging business, but how do we get the business community behind cities, behind placemaking, in partnership with universities and in partnership with the cultural sector?
Thank you. Well, can we start with you, actually?
Yes,
on that
yes,
one?
of course.
And then
We ought to hear your experience of how you kicked off the Hull City of Culture and got those, I think it was 22 of them putting up. How much each do they, Andrew?
Not a lot of money, 17,000 each.
Well, I think that is a lot of money, actually. 22 times £17,000 is a lot of money in anybody's language. And you galvanised the community to believe in the improvement of the city. And you articulated to them a sense of civic responsibility and excitement and a vision that they could get behind. And they opened their purses. And that was a really interesting microcosm, actually, of how it could be done. The truth is that business supported arts and culture better before the credit crunch than after. And business giving fell off a cliff during the credit crunch, whereas individual giving actually rose. The individuals of this country magnificently stepped up to help arts and culture, and it may be the same in education, I don't know, but we'll hear, I'm sure, in a second. And I think it's been improving, but where I see really interesting business support, I'm thinking of Bruntwood in Manchester, the property company, and indeed Peel Holdings, who've really made arts and culture an important part of Salford. I guess something we could probably do a lot better than we do, and I've got a colleague at the Arts Council called Claire Titley who's in charge of this, and I'm sure she's probably doing it and will tell me I'm very wicked to have suggested we weren't. But I suspect we need to get more business ambassadors saying this is why I do it. When I was talking to the guy who owns Bruntwood, who backs so much theatre, not just in Manchester but around the country, the way he articulates why he does it, we ought to be getting him and other businesses who are doing it to articulate to other businesses in a network sense why they're doing it, how they believe in investing in their community. I think all of you probably would give me examples, though I suspect they'd be quite isolated examples of in your own place where business is getting behind it. But we have a big job to do to radiate that message, don't we, I think? Yeah. I don't know how it is in education.
well, we hear a lot about business partnerships in other sectors, and I wondered whether you thought that culture was not performing particularly strongly.
I think that some of the problems are actually, I get this question sometimes, and sometimes I push back on the idea that there's something specifically or particularly problematic with the cultural sector. And the example I use is that when I was at Leeds, I had a fascinating year where I sat on Marks and Spencer's Innovation Board. And they only, at that stage, may still be true, interacted with 3 universities in the country. And it wasn't because they didn't have an interest in interacting with other universities, but they simply didn't have the resource, time and wherewithal to try and find a way around how many UK universities. So they were broadly satisfied with the 3 they worked with, and they just rested content with that. I think there has. I mean, people were saying at the start of today that universities, I mean, certainly in the 25 years that I've been in an academic career, they have changed very significantly. I always, as a historian, sort of pause on words like unprecedented change. But when I arrived at Leeds, 40 departments used to do their own annual presentations separately to the Vice-Chancellor and Finance Director. There were 40 annual review meetings for 40 departments or something like that. We now have an infrastructure of faculties and colleges which allows us to grow, build and develop things at scale that simply didn't exist when I came into the academic career. With the research councils, one of the big interventions that was launched under my predecessor, Rick Rylance, was to set up 4 what we call knowledge exchange or creative economy hubs. Some people in the room will perhaps know something about those, specifically designed to improve interactions between the university and cultural and sort of business sector. And we're just actually getting the reports on those 4-year investments this summer, but the initial signs look very positive in what they've achieved. And we're now taking stock and thinking what our next big initiative will be in the sort of creative economy. I think one thing to do for research councils is to actually think about where we have bespoke interventions. I mean, we can't run a bespoke intervention for everything. We don't have the capacity to do that. So we have to be really clear-sighted where a targeted intervention is required, and then build a program, specifically designed for specific purposes. And that's what we've been doing in the creative economy, and I imagine that's what we will continue to do because we still feel that's necessary.
Thank you. It feels like an area for development, so thank you for raising that. Are there any questions on the balcony? Yes, thank you.
Hi.
Is there a microphone?
Hello.
Go on.
Hi. I'm Dave Camlin from Sage Gateshead. My question, I think, is maybe more for Andrew Thompson, but the panel may have a view as well. It's the question is, what's your view of the opportunities and the threats for HE and cultural sector partnerships arising from the proposed consolidation of the research councils into a single body?
Yeah. Positive, actually. Over the last 4 or 5 months, with my other 6 chief executives, we've been making the argument for the creation of this new thing that's going to be called UK Research and Innovation. For those in the room who are not familiar, this is to bring the 7 research councils together to give us a stronger collective personality. But right from day one, we've argued this has to be a single collective organisation. It has to look both ways in terms of making us more cohesive as 7 councils when we need to be, but also recognising, as Sir Paul Nurse said in his report, that we would need to retain our distinct and different identities, and we would need to have our own organisational infrastructure if we're ever going to have a chance of developing and delivering a research strategy for 30% of UK active researchers. So I think it's opportunity, actually. The AHRC will continue to do what it's previously been doing in terms of developing partnerships with the arts and cultural sector, but the opportunity is to get the importance of the arts and cultural sector recognised across the 7 research councils, not just within one of them. So actually on that, my glass is genuinely half full. What I would say, though, is that there are 2 essential preconditions to UK research and innovation being successful. One is the individual councils have to have proper and meaningful delegated budgetary authority and stability, and so we wait to see whether that's going to be delivered in the legislation. We've been reassured that it will. And secondly, and a personal view, is that I think each of the 7 councils need to, this is where the language gets confusing, retain their own councils as governing bodies. And I think that in terms of the effectiveness of UK research and public accountability, it would be a retrograde step if we didn't.
Thank you. Over here.
Hello, my name's Sharon Gill. I'm from Rotherham Open Arts Renaissance, the MPO in Rotherham. And we have some huge job to do in terms of generational cultural change. And we can't do that without a physical infrastructure. There are lots of problems facing Rotherham. There's one theatre, there's no cinema, there's no art gallery per se. It's all done on that charitable pop-up shop basis. So while there's a huge swathe of enthusiasm and engagement in community art, especially around anti-hate crime, all sorts of initiatives trying to bring the community back to a cohesive whole, there's nowhere then for that to be displayed, performed. So there's real financial difficulties in securing match funding. The businesses in Rotherham, yeah, they might be doing well, but they haven't got the 50 to 100,000 match I'm going to need to put an art centre together. The Rotherham Council are very committed. They're putting culture at the heart of their regeneration now, but that's still quite a long way off. So I put it to the panel, how does a place that is perhaps overshadowed by Sheffield, by Leeds, by Nottingham, where the attention is inevitably drawn to, and the traffic going down the M1, how do we pull them sideways to Rotherham a little bit?
Pat, can we
Start with
you.
It is a real challenge, and one of the things that I think about all the time is kind of properly reflecting and kind of portraying the country that we live in. And that isn't just through news, because, you know, that can be very one-sided, depending on which part of the country that you do live in, and what makes kind of the headlines. At the same time, again, with not a huge budget to spend, there are many mouths to feed, I think, when you think about how can you really reflect this place well, beyond news. And it's really hard. And what I do know is that we certainly can't do or fix this on our own. We can only do that if we kind of link up and work with other people to come up with those opportunities, actually. And it doesn't have to be a big live event, for me. It's about, I suppose, sowing the seeds of things that can start to reflect Rotherham in different ways, in positive ways that will help you achieve what you need to achieve. You know, if that works or not, I don't know. Our responsibility, I think, is for the people that pay the licence fee in Rotherham to make sure that we are kind of properly reflecting that place. But for you, I think it's, and well, for all of us, it's just linking together and having a really clear objective. You know, what is the thing that you really want to make happen? And just being really clear about that. And it's hard because we have a lot of towns and cities and neighbourhoods and communities in this country that feel the same way.
And Andrew, would you agree that leadership and partnership are essential?
Absolutely. But I mean, you know, for us, it's a very interesting, it's an important question, actually. You know, there's a strategic question you wrestle with there around sort of concentration of funding. I think, you know, the right answer is a holy grail, but the balance that we try and strike, and I hope I've understood the spirit of the question correctly, is that of that 98 million I referred to earlier on, 35 to 40 million is protected for what we call open call responsive mode applications. So this is any researcher in any UK university who may well want to partner and build in as a partner a cultural organisation or an arts organisation in Rotherham, can apply for a large project grant up to $750,000, a fellowship or a network, exploratory network grant. So that allows some flexibility, freedom. But by the same token, when we did, you know, the scheme for knowledge exchange hubs, we were only able to fund 4 of them. We'd love to have, you know, a budget of 150 million that will allow us to fund 8 or 12, because we wanted to do an intervention that was ambitious, significant, and at scale. So we're constantly trying to get the right balance in our funding provision and make sure that on the one hand funding isn't over concentrated to 12 big universities or the Russell Group, but on the other hand that we don't sort of salami slice so much what we do that when it comes to sort of making our case in tough spending reviews, we can't land the argument. So it's a good question.
And the same for Arts Council. How do we make sure that limited resources are spread equitably?
Look, of course, I completely understand what you've said, and you articulated it brilliantly. I think there's a particular challenge for places that don't have a tourist economy, because that tends to support arts and culture in a way. And I think there's a particular challenge for councils in the north who are in real terms being cut more than councils in the south, and giving them control over their business rates is not the same deal when you have lower ratepayers and lower levels of business rate paying and so on. So those are a set of unique challenges, and we've had a lot to say, though I'm not going to talk more about it today, about what the challenge to local authority funding of arts and culture is, which is going south very rapidly as their responsibilities for social care get more and more expensive and their government funding gets cut. So those are particular challenges. I wonder whether you think you've got the leadership you need in Rotherham, because that quality of leadership, that idea that somebody or a small number of individuals will stand up and express a vision for a place, and other people will follow and say, yes, I believe in that vision, we can do this. And then what flows from the leadership is the partnership we were talking about between lots of different agencies. The last thing I'd say is that where there is low arts and cultural take-up, where there is a dearth of other arts organisations, that's an issue for a national development agency. It's okay, we can't, as the Arts Council, sit here and say, well, we didn't get any applications. If we didn't get any applications or enough applications for an area, that's an issue for us. That's why, we've had our Creative People and Places scheme, which is putting more than 20 million into specific consortia in areas of low arts and cultural take-up. And it's not a huge sum of money, frankly, but it's a start, and it's an articulation of an approach, which is everybody saying it's nobody's fault if they haven't got the arts organisations and they haven't made the applications. It's our issue, it's our challenge, all of us. What can we do to try and build an arts infrastructure in an area and build capacity and build talent? So you issue a good challenge.
And I think there are also people in the room who have some very relevant experience in terms of areas and places which are ambitious and growing, Sunderland being the one that comes to mind. So again, I think that's a conversation that could be ongoing over lunch and perhaps during the afternoon. And speaking of lunch, I'm aware that we're running up towards time on the agenda. Is there one final question that anybody would like to...
in the middle, then. Oh, there's one at the back.
We'll take the one at the back and the one on that side at the back too.
She changed her mind.
Thank you very much. My name is Joyce Lee. I'm resident director of a theatre company in Bradford. We're NPO as well. My question is around creative case for diversity, especially disability, including physical, sensory, and learning disabilities. So artists and talents with disabilities, they not only face arts funding cuts, but also cuts affecting their quality of life. We're human first before we're artists, academic, and policymakers. So, and these cuts, like access to work, changes in job seekers' allowance, and assessments by ATOS, benefits. These are the barriers directly affecting our artists, and it's a threat outside of our control. And well, before Jeremy Corbyn becomes our Prime Minister, what do you think our role is in overcoming these barriers?
Thank you. Could we also take the question at the back?
Jeremy Corbyn, the Prime Minister.
Thanks. Mel Hewell, Newcastle University. I just wanted to pose the question, what future for rural communities with arts and culture? We've very much heard this morning about urban environments, and would just like a discussion about that. Thank you.
Thanks. So 2 questions there. One around our role, particularly in relation to disability and whether people and artists are particularly disadvantaged, and what can we as a sector and organisations do about that? And the rural question, as we have focused not exclusively but largely on urban areas. Andrew, can I ask you to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a slightly anecdotal response to the first question. When I was in Leeds, the first 2 PhD projects that I supervised was the first one was on the history of disability in Victorian Britain, and the second one was on the history of the disabled soldier in the First World War.
Very interesting.
And they were both fascinating sort of projects, and it took me into an area that I actually didn't have a lot of expertise in myself. I'm not sure that in the arts and humanities that actually we're connecting some of the fantastic research that we do into diversity with making the political sort of case and argument for it. It seems to me that those 2 things could come much closer together. It ought to be an area where as disciplines we're exercising some intellectual leadership and without being self-critical at the same time. As far as the rural side is concerned, one thing that struck me, one of our 3 research priorities as a council is in heritage, funding research in heritage. And I think that we, over recent years, have seen quite a big growth, actually, in applications in terms of heritage as landscape. Some very interesting partnerships with the National Trust and English Heritage, but a whole variety of heritage organisations taking heritage out of an urban context and thinking it more in a rural and landscape context.
Thank you. Pat, obviously the BBC has a very strong commitment to diversity, and including socio-economic diversity, and what role do you think we could have around disability as well?
Well, we do, and I think it's something that we've just got better at more recently, rather than kind of historically, but it's something that we're incredibly focused on now. And I think rather than it just simply being a desire, it's now we've embedded diversity, and this isn't just across age or sex or BAME, it's everything from neurodiversity and different kind of backgrounds from our employees, where people are coming from. We've embedded this into the infrastructure of the organisation in terms of appraisals, recruitment, really specific things about portrayal, which kind of not kicked off, but was sort of highlighted when Danny Cohen kind of raised the point about panel shows. And I think we needed to do that. We needed to formalise our commitment, because otherwise I think it's easy to want to do it but not quite get there. So that is really critical, and we've got a new initiative called Project Diamond now, where everybody is completely signed up to that and answerable, which is really key. And the rural thing is really interesting as well. And it's similar, I suppose, my response to the comment I made about Rotherham, in terms of how we do manage to kind of reflect things going on everywhere. And essentially, this isn't a science, but inevitably, if you've got fewer people living in kind of rural areas, you'll probably get kind of less knocks on your door about what's going on. It's our kind of responsibility to just make it easy for people to do that. And I would also encourage people to and organisations to let us know what's going on, because sometimes I feel there's an expectation to, sort of, particularly sort of for me and my team, to go around saying, what are you doing? And actually we just need to know. And again, historically, we perhaps haven't been fantastic about being very joined up and organised about getting back to people, but that's one of the things that we hope our team in Salford are making better. It's a bit like a directory inquiries, to just make it a bit simpler and smaller.
Thank you.
So briefly, because we're going to lunch, by the look on your face, Jane.
Is that a hungry look?
Joyce, you talk about disabled artists, and you quite rightly say that recent changes to benefit payments have restricted the possibilities of their participating in arts and culture. It's true. And deaf and disabled artists need particular support and additional resources, quite apart from the money to live on, to also perform and take part in arts and culture. And I can assure you the Arts Council has made this point. But nobody on this stage has it in their power to change that. We can articulate it, but we don't make the decisions on that. What I would say is, though, the prize is fantastic if we get it together, because about 4 nights ago I went to the touring production of Ramps on the Moon's The Government Inspector by Gogol, and I caught it at Theatre Royal Stratford East in East London. And this was a sensational production with a massive number of deaf and disabled actors and all sorts of different performers. And it was slick, witty, brilliant, sharp. There was no, it was just totally professional, but also very, very good. And what I loved in particular was the way they'd made the signers part of the action. You know how so often we have the signers standing on one side of the stage, waving their arms about like windmills, and you think, it's just slightly odd, isn't it? It's good, we have signers, of course, but it's slightly odd. They had integrated the signers into the production, and they became characters, but they were signing as well. And so that's the prize. It's unlocking the creative potential of all those deaf and disabled artists, and it's wonderful when you get it right. Rural arts was mentioned. Yeah, that's an important part of the Arts Council's agenda, certainly. About 15% of Arts Council total funding goes to rural areas. About 17% of the population, as defined, lives in rural areas. We're slightly behind, but not miles behind. We work quite closely with DEFRA. We work very closely with actually tens, if not hundreds, of county councils on these issues. I'm sure we could do more, but it's very much on our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank Culture Forum North for inviting us all to speak. And I'd particularly like to thank them and the speakers for including examples and case studies from right across the North. And I think this forum really reflects the whole of the North, from Cumbria to Teesside to Yorkshire to Merseyside. And I think particularly in the context of some of the political conversations at the moment, that's really important. And I'd also like to thank our speakers, Peter Bazalgette, Andrew and Pat, for fascinating presentations and also for stimulating, hopefully, conversations over lunch and into the afternoon. So could you join me in thanking our speakers?
Well done. Good job.